So today we're going to be taking a look at the internal lockwork of a Colt Mark III series revolver. This will apply to all the Mark III series guns. Doesn't matter if it's Border Patrol, Trooper, Lawman, Official Police. I think they even had an Officer's Model Mark III, Metropolitan Police, all those. So we're going to be looking at how the lockwork in these is arranged and talk about some of the pieces and parts. And so to take this gun apart, your screws may be different sizes. I've seen some guns, some Mark III series Colts, where this particular screw is thinner, needs a thinner screwdriver bit than mine does. But I'm going to be using Brownell's Magna tips, and the two sizes that I'm going to need are 210-3 and 210-5. We're also going to need a paper clip and a hammer with a nice soft face on it. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and take the grips off of this gun. And this is a little bit difficult through the camera, but I got a tripod sitting in front of me, but it'll be okay. The grips will come off by removing this one screw, and that was the 210-3 bit. We're going to use it for most of the screws. We only need the thicker one for one screw. And these grips can be tight, but that's okay. That's what you want. Set that aside. Now the next screw that we're going to remove is this one right here, and I'm going to zoom in a little for this. Inside of here, I'm going to have to do it off camera. Inside of this screw there is a spring and detent. Okay, got that loosened up a little bit. There's a spring and detent that you don't need to lose underneath this screw. And you want good screwdrivers so you don't mar up your screw slots. But I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on this and unscrew it by hand the rest of the way, so that maybe you can see how those pieces sit down there sort of in situ. So here's the screw. It's actually just a hollow cap with a screw slot on top. And then you'll have this spring that sits just like that in this hollow cap. And then there's a detent in here. And this detent fits onto this whole assembly. The spring goes inside of the detent and allows it to sit down in this hollow cap, sort of like that. So there you can see how that works. And the removal of that screw, spring, and detent is going to allow us to remove the cylinder and crane. So when you do this, you want to line up a cylinder flute with this area right here, and then just sort of work it out. This one is extremely tight, and I've not really been able to diagnose why, but it will just work straight out. So this groove right here is what that detent rides in to keep it fixed in the frame. just grab that detent. If you'll notice the way this detent's shaped, it rides right here to keep the whole crane in the frame. So, now that we've got that out, the next screw we're going to be removing is this one right here, front of the trigger guard. Doesn't really matter what order you do these two screws, but I usually do the one in front of the trigger guard first. And I'm going to go ahead and break it loose off camera, just because it's easier. So that's broken loose now. And as a matter of fact, this will make it much easier to do on camera. Just to get that screw out. So there's that screw. Now for this next one that was under the grips, this is where on my Revolver I'm going to need the 210-5 bit. That one came loose nice and easily. And so with that removed, we can now remove our side plate. Now, historically, people who don't really know what they're doing will try to stick a screwdriver or something up under the side plate and pry it off. Never do that. That is the worst thing you can do to one of these guns. You'll end up marring the side plate up, bending something. The correct way to do it, and I'll tell you what, before we do that, I almost forgot, we're going to need to capture our mainspring. So, with the side plate still on, you're going to cock your hammer, and right here there's going to be a little hole that you stick your paper clip in so that it goes all the way through the frame. And then what we're going to do with that is let the tension off the hammer. Now our mainspring is captured. So now, back to the side plate. The way that you want to remove the side plate, you want to put your finger here to capture this cylinder release, because it's got a spring behind it and it's going to want to go flying when the side plate comes off. You're going to take your soft non-marring hammer and just tap the frame. And you'll notice that that side plate is already lifting off. There went our mainspring because the side plates come off enough to let it fall out. There goes the side plate. So, since we've captured our cylinder release, we can remove the side plate, cylinder release, and spring as a unit. The way that this cylinder release works, well, you remove it and there's this little Z spring that gives it that's constantly pushing it forward. So that little spring is what's acting on your cylinder release. So we can remove that, it just slides out. Remove the spring, and this is how the cylinder release fits. It's almost a dovetail, and so it just slides right in there. Kind of hard to do around a tripod, but it slides right in there, slides in that groove. Here's the back of our side plate. This is your channel where the hand moves. This is where the cylinder stop is attached to the side plate. And the Mark III series and later have this little, if I can get that to focus. Oh, it's trying to focus on the frame. We'll move that. Have this little piece of nylon or plastic, and what that's for is just to keep your cylinder release from scratching the side plate right there. It's slightly raised just to keep the finish from being scratched by the cylinder release. So now that we've got that all apart, we can get to the revolver. Oh, and here's your captured mainspring. This acts on the hammer, and then right now, of course, it's captured. Do not remove this paper clip or this will fly apart. You'll never find it. So now we can get to the internal workings. So what we have here is a pretty slick design, but it also makes this one of the most infuriating guns to reassemble. This is your handspring. Well, we might have to move this so it'll focus. This little leaf spring right here, and you can see how that's attached, is your handspring. That's what's acting on the hand. This is your transfer bar. Now the way that works, it sits on this pin right here. This is our hand that turns the cylinder. This sits right here, and then this spring, ideally, and it's hard to make all these pieces work with the side plate off, but that spring, there we go. Wow, that's actually staying on. I can't believe that. That piece never wants to stay on. It makes reassembly very difficult. But hopefully you can see there how all this works. Now I'm going to work the action, and I'm probably going to have to hold this on because without the side plate supporting it, it wants to come off. One thing I will say before I do this: if you have the side plate removed and for whatever reason you have to or want to work the action, you never want to do that with the mainspring installed if your side plate's off. And the reason for that, all of these pins that are attached to the frame, they need the support of this side plate. Well, that's a screw hole, but right here, if you have your mainspring in here and all that force is acting on these pins and you work the action without the side plate on, these pins in the frame can snap off, and you've got a real problem if those snap off. So that's my disclaimer. But we can see that leaf spring, the handspring acting on the hand, and we can see if we push back on the hand, it's giving it constant forward pressure. So the way that all this works, you can see there's our hand pushing the cylinder around. We're at full cock now. And you can see the transfer bar, and the hand spring is not actually exerting much force on the hand at full cock. When we let the hammer down, of course our transfer bar is going to allow the firing pin to push through the frame. And now that the transfer bar has been pushed forward, this little leaf spring is pushing pretty hard. I mean, not hard, but enough to fully power the hand. Then as we let go of the trigger, the whole mechanism moves down. And now this piece wants to fly off. That's what happens right there. Every time you're trying to reassemble this revolver, this whole transfer bar and spring assembly doesn't want to sit on this pin down here. So that's what makes reassembly so difficult, because you need it to stay in place. But that's how the handspring works. Now we're going to go ahead and actually remove this, and we'll remove the hand for right now, and it just sits on there. So now we're going to take a look at the trigger mechanism and how it works. Of course, here's your trigger, here's your hammer. So I'll just let you get a good look. Right there. Might be zoomed in too far. Is our single action hammer trigger engagement. Cocking the hammer pulls that trigger up. Locks when you pull the trigger. You can see it moves just enough to let the hammer fall. Now in double action, we can see, and I'm going to simulate pressure on the hammer from the mainspring, how that double action trigger works. There's our trigger moving, cocking the hammer until the hammer is able to slip past and fall. Now, if we want to, and here is how our cylinder release works. The cylinder release has a hole in the back, or a slot that sits over this protrusion, and when we pull our cylinder release back, it's just moving this piece out of the hole in the back of the cylinder. But I'm assuming that most people here understand how a trigger and hammer interact, so that's not really what we're here to look at. If you want to remove the hammer, pull the trigger until the hammer clears this area of the frame, and the hammer will just lift out. So here's where things kind of get interesting, at least to me. Our cylinder stop, or the bolt, here's how it works. Very simple mechanism. This is sort of this is not like older Colts. This is more akin to a Smith & Wesson type bolt, but you can see the interaction as the trigger is pulled till it slips past, pops back up. Then when the trigger's released, and our bolt spring is just this coil spring right here. The Mark III revolvers make heavy use of coil springs where they can. So that's our bolt return spring. You can see how the bolt interacts with it right there. Now, here's our trigger return spring. And you can see it's just resting on the trigger. As you pull the trigger, that spring lifts and its natural at-rest state is down. Just almost looks like the type of spring you'd see on a clothespin. This screw right here is actually a trigger, I guess, over travel screw. I'm unsure if those were ever meant to be serviced by the user, if those are only supposed to be adjusted by the factory, but that's definitely its purpose. There's that spring working. The trigger return spring, the bolt. So, these Mark III revolvers make heavy use of sintered steel parts, such as the hammer. Now, sintered steel is, I guess you could say, sort of like MIM, except I believe MIM parts are usually through hardened. These parts are not through hardened. These hammers, if you file on these hammers, these case hardened hammers, you can file through this case hardening and expose the soft metal underneath, and at that point the hammer's ruined. From what I understand, the way that these revolvers were assembled at the factory is that the technicians or assemblers just had a big bin of parts, and they would just keep trying parts until one fit. There was no hand fitting that I'm aware of on these Mark III revolvers, because you couldn't do any filing on these parts on most of them, because they're that sintered steel, which is a form of MIM. I believe with the sintered steel, it was like powdered metal that was put in molds, and then some sort of bonding action or agent was injected to bond the powdered metal. That's just from what I understand. Feel free to do your own research and leave a comment below if I got that completely wrong. But now I want to show you how the hand interacts with the cylinder, because that is another area of difference between the Mark III series and older Colt revolvers. So hang on just 1 second, let me get this partially put back together. So, I want to show you how the hand interacts with the cylinder. And I didn't do a very good job right there. So let me try that again. We can see the hand pushing the ratchet, and obviously this would be working better if the side plate were installed. But we can see that the hand just pushes past the ratchet teeth on the cylinder. Let me see if I can get a better view of that. There we go, if it'll focus. Just pushes past those teeth. And of course it's doing it even worse because of how I'm holding and because we have no side plate. But hopefully you can get an idea that once the cylinder has turned, the hand just sort of pushes past. And of course this thing's falling apart on me because I don't have the side plate on. But the action of the hand just pushing by that ratchet is because of the design of the hand in these Mark III series revolvers. And it is different than the older guns. You always hear about the Python and how it locked up tighter than other revolvers. And that's true. The old style, what they call V-spring action Colts, locked up tighter than any revolver that I'm aware of. And the reason that they did was because the hand was different and the ratchet teeth were different. And there's no good way for me to explain it, but in a later episode, we're going to be taking a look at an old style Colt action. So hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate in a later episode why the old guns locked up tighter than these Mark III series guns. But this hand is a different design than the earlier guns. It's just got a flat top, a flat shelf at top that pushes on the ratchet. The older guns had a double stepped hand, so this surface right here that pushes on the ratchet, it actually came back and up, and there was a second identical surface for pushing on the ratchet. When the trigger was pulled on the old guns, the bottom surface forced itself against the ratchet, which turned the cylinder clockwise further and forced the cylinder notch tightly against the bolt down here and made it so that the cylinder was solidly locked up, no rotational play. We'll try to get a good shot of how that worked in a later episode. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and put this gun back together, and then we'll have some closing thoughts. I know I said earlier that there was no hand fitting on these guns, but it does look like there was some hand fitting on the hand. There was some hand fitting. Haha. But that doesn't surprise me. Most revolvers, if they need fitting anywhere, it's on the hand, because the interaction of the hand and the ratchet is one of the most important interactions in a revolver. Even the new Pythons, I've seen promotional material from Colt at SHOT Show saying that the only part that requires fitting is the hand, and that they somehow measure it with a laser and then fit it. I'm not really sure, but just so you know, it does look like there was some fitting going on the hand. So the Mark III series would go on to inspire all the later Colts up until the discontinuation of Colt revolvers in about 1999 or 2000. The Trooper Mark V series would come next, and it's basically the same mechanism but with a tang type grip like you would see on a GP100. And that's what the old King Cobra, Anaconda, Boa, Kodiak Grizzly, and all those are based on. So they've got very similar action to this. Now you hear a lot of people talking about how, oh, the old Anacondas are so much better than the new ones, blah blah blah. Well, the new Anaconda has the same action as the new Python, which is 20 times closer to the old Python's action than the King Cobra or the old Anaconda ever were. The old King Cobra, Anaconda, and Boa were all based on basically this gun with a modified grip frame. They had nothing in common with the old Pythons, Detective Specials, Diamondbacks, New Service, Official Police, and all those guns. So at a later episode, we're actually going to be looking at the lockwork of an old Python versus a new Python, and explaining how some of the differences are actually improvements, and maybe we'll see a few things that are not improvements. But I just wanted to talk about these Trooper Mark III series, or the Mark III series guns. Are they bad guns? No, they're great guns. They got pretty good actions. They're different from the old Colts. They don't have the bank vault lockup. They don't have the leaf mainspring or rebound lever at all. They're just different. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and we're going to look at some more revolvers and their lockwork. We're going to try to do Colts and then maybe branch out into some other makes of revolvers. But I hope you enjoyed this look at the lockwork of the Mark III series of Colts. And until next time, we'll see you. Thanks for watching.